alongside to the Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? It sounds like a trick question because it is a trick question. There they are. We've been following this part of the story in St. Matthew's Gospel for a few weeks now. They're at the Jerusalem temple, the city center, the main stage. It's prime time, Monday in Holy Week, and the crowds all around are still buzzing over the arrival of this rabbi from the Galilee, who seems in some way to be the successor to his cousin John the Baptist, who was recently executed, but who still would hold a place in the heart of the people, who was remembered for his courage as he was unafraid to speak truth to power, as John had confronted the authorities for their self-serving silence in the face of the corruption and immorality of King Herod. Even a hint of accommodation on this question, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Even a hint of accommodation, and the priests and Pharisees know that the crowd will just shrug its collective shoulders and move on to the next Messiah. On the other hand, these temple precincts are carefully policed, Roman guards standing out on the edge of the crowd even now, and any hint of sedition, and they'll have Jesus locked up before anybody really knows what has happened. It's Passover festival in Jerusalem, the streets overflowing with religious pilgrims from all over the world, and the civil authorities are on high alert. So what do you say, Jesus? Do the scriptures allow this or not? So we read this familiar story again this year. We're reminded that for a guy who probably didn't have much of a formal education, Jesus really does a masterful job standing toe-to-toe with the elites of his day. They think they're going to take care of this country bumpkin with one hand tied behind their backs. There's the great word in verse 16, right at the beginning of our reading today. They took counsel how to entangle him. They think they've got him there. You can almost see them smirking as they ask the question. But before you know it, once again, the tables are turned. It's a nice touch, actually an elegant moment in public debate, as Jesus asks the Pharisees here to provide him with a prop, the coin, and then shifts the focus of the dialogue from himself to them by asking the question, whose image is this? It's a small thing, but it's a skillful dynamic within a debate. And now they're answering him. They're on his turf. They're responding to his concerns. And once they have answered Caesar's, he then says, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So and that's an interesting construction. That the first part of that answer, anyway, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, kind of slips around, actually, the question that they have asked him. We have to accept the premise that if the coin has Caesar's image on it, then it must be his somehow. It's like finding a debit card on the sidewalk outside the bank. You see whose name is on the front, and then you should return it to its rightful owner. It's not really an answer to the question that was asked, but it does catch them for a moment. They pause. They're forced then, as everyone leans forward, to hear the second part of what Jesus has to say. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Jesus is not letting them get away even for a second from the continuing force of the parables that he has just told, those three parables, one after another. The parable of the two sons, the parable of the unruly tenants, that's still fresh in their mind, the parable of the wedding banquet. We remember especially those tenants who betrayed their covenant with the owner of the vineyard, who refused to hold up their end of the deal, who attacked and killed the messenger the owner had sent to them, who even murdered the son who had come on the father's behalf to effect reconciliation. To say that the tenants who were now at any moment to feel the full weight of judgment as the owner was about to return with an overwhelming force to remove them from the vineyard and consign them to darkness and destruction. And they all know who Jesus is talking about, who the tenants are, what their stewardship has been like, killing the messengers, both the ancient prophets and sitting silently while John the Baptist was arrested and killed. Stewardship not about serving the owner of the vineyard faithfully, but about protecting their own privilege and status and wealth. The tenants of the vineyard. So now it's Monday and Holy Week, and the owner has sent his son, and Jesus knows what it is that they plan to do even before they themselves have worked out the details. This question about paying taxes is really just a distraction. Once again, for the officials of the religious establishment, an effort to shift the focus to an emphasis on ceremonial purity, outward conformity, external obedience, and to avoid the deeper question that Jesus asks of the full and genuine obedience of the heart, of a humility, integrity, and love and faith. On a church leadership podcast the other day on the topic of stewardship, as it is stewardship season, Harold Lewis used to call it stewardship tide. That's the Anglican version of stewardship season, stewardship tide in most churches at this time of year. I heard, anyway, a discussion of the biblical idea of the tithe, the command to present that tenth of the harvest or of the flock as a sacrificial offering. It's important to know that what the tithe was not, was a tax that would give God his share of my stuff. What it was instead was the reminder that it's all God's stuff, and that for this moment he was going to hire me to be the steward or the manager of the remaining 90% of his portfolio. Not 10% his and 90% mine, but all his, to be invested productively to achieve the returns that he has specified. So the challenge of good stewardship then, faithful stewardship, doesn't really have to do with that 10% off the top that goes to the owner. It has to do with how the other 90% is invested and what it accomplishes. The question asked by the speaker on the podcast was whether in our own approach to stewardship we don't tie ourselves up in knots every fall talking about the tithe, that literal or symbolic 10% or whatever 10% of commitment of our harvest and flock that we represent on those little blue pledge cards, but remain conveniently silent about the other 90% of what God has given all of us to manage on his behalf. The question about what it means to be a good and faithful steward as it applies, well, yes, to what goes into the offering plates on Sunday, but even more what is left afterwards in our wallets and our checkbooks. The priests and the Pharisees of the temple tie themselves in knots trying to parse the sentences and give the most precise legalistic and formal emphasis on the issues of the 10%. But when it comes to the rest, they are running off the rails. what Jesus had said of them when he quoted Isaiah, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." There they are, feathering their own nests, propping up their own little kingdoms, while the heart and the soul of the covenant is ignored and covered up. And it turns out there are crosses waiting just outside the city walls for anyone who dares to come along and call attention to what is going on. "You're trying to entangle me with words," Jesus says, "but let's talk instead about what's in our hearts." Walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself for us, an offering and